When I was in the process of discerning Catholicism, we were attending my local parish, St. Mary of the Assumption Catholic Church in Park City, Utah. As is their tradition, they hold their anniversary celebration around the time of the Feast of the Assumption, their namesake, where they process 4 miles from the original church, the oldest Catholic church in Utah, to their new location. And they do this carrying a statue of Mary and praying the rosary. I was trying to embrace Catholicism and really attempting to understand it with an open mind, but I also was a little uneasy about this. You see, I grew up being told that Catholics worship Mary and they worship idols. And so in my mind, this sure looked like my impression of Mary idol worship. Is this okay or is it not? And then came the Good Friday service where we venerate a crucifix, kneeling in front of a statue of Jesus on the cross, kissing him even? Isn't this idol worship? Well, to understand this question, we need to understand icons. And to better understand icons, we need to understand the Second Council of Nicaea. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Let me offer a sincere thank you for joining me today as we continue our series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils. Whether you're a regular listener or you just happen to stumble upon this episode, thanks for taking some time to join me today. Just a reminder that this podcast is 100% supported by listeners just like you. There's a couple of ways to support Why Catholic. You can contribute by being a monthly donor, purchase something from the Why Catholic merch shop, and you can invite me to come speak at your next event. Links for all of those details are in the show notes. This is our 11th episode in our series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils. We'll be discussing Ecumenical Council number 7, the Second Council of Nicaea. This council marks a type of cutoff point. The Eastern Orthodox and many creedal Protestant denominations even only recognize the first 7 councils as ecumenical and authoritative. This is also considered the final Christological council. Up until now, all of these councils were dealing with the nature of Christ in some form or fashion. And after this council, we'll see a lot more debate centered on ecclesiastical divisions. Before we begin discussing this council, it's important to talk about both the religious beliefs as well as the political climate at the time. To understand some of the religious sentiments, we probably ought to start with the ancient heresy called Gnosticism. I talked about this extensively in episode 127, if you want to get even more of an understanding. There were 3 generalizations of Gnosticism. A dualistic anthropology, meaning a contrast between the material versus the spiritual world. Secondly, a dualistic theology, where you have a supreme pure God monad versus the demiurge, which created a corrupt world. And thirdly, the gnosis, which is a type of mystical, spiritual, and secret knowledge. In other words, in the Gnostic worldview, the spiritual was good and the physical was corrupted and even evil. And the goal of all human beings was to ascend beyond the physical to the spiritual. So much of the New Testament combats the Gnostic heresy. I think the writings of St. John in particular can best be understood if you understand Gnosticism. And like I said, if you want to hear why I think that, please take a listen to episode 127. The more that I study church history, the more that I think these heresies just don't go away. They morph into something different, some different version of heresy. For example, I think today's transgender movement is the 21st century Western version of Gnosticism. We all need to try and transcend the physical world because the physical world inhibits the spiritual world. Your body is wrong. Who you are is independent of your biological sex. Sound familiar? Well, during the 8th century, the strand of Gnosticism that was most popular was called Manichaeanism. Mani, who lived in the 3rd century in the Sasanian or Persian Empire, is believed to be the founder of this religious worldview. And this was very similar to Gnosticism, the tension between the physical and the spiritual. We need to overcome the physical and rise to the spiritual enlightenment, etc. As we discussed in the previous couple of episodes, the major heresy in Christianity around this time was monophysite Christianity, which said that Jesus had one divine nature rather than a human and a divine nature. And then to complicate matters, the Muslims eventually took over the Persian Empire, and they rejected any Christological viewpoints. There is only one God, Jesus isn't God, etc. So you have this intermingling of all these religious ideas influencing the Eastern Roman Empire during the 8th century. Now, on top of all of this, we really start to see the rise of imperialism. The Byzantine emperor tried to make the claim that he was the head of not just the state, but also the church as well. And he tried to exercise his authority over religious institutions like monasteries. In 714, the Inauzarian dynasty began ruling the Byzantine Empire, and its first emperor was Leo III, not to be confused with Pope Leo III, who would be pope a little later in history. Remembering all these names is confusing enough. Imagine if there was an Emperor Leo III at the same time there was a Pope Leo III. Emperor Leo III decided that icons were idolatrous, and in 726 he banned them. This is known as iconoclasm. The iconoclasts were those that disdained icons or religious images, whereas the iconophiles, or iconodulias as we'll call them for this episode, were those that supported them and venerated them as part of religious practices. Why Leo III suddenly wanted to ban icons and religious art seems to be a mystery to most historians, and we can merely speculate. It's possible that it was a combination of things. Perhaps he was influenced by Manichaeism and the rejection of the physical realm. It could also be that the Muslims, who were iconoclasts, influenced Christianity in that region, and combine that all with the fact that icons were mainly being produced by monks in monasteries, and so maybe Leo III really saw this as a way of gaining authority over the monasteries. Who knows? But what we do know is that he banned the use of icons, and the iconoclasts would gouge out the eyes of religious images, burn images, tear down crucifixes, and even persecute iconodulias. This led to a bitter clash between Leo's Eastern iconoclast policies and the practices of the West, led by Popes Gregory II and III. Leo III also faced opposition in the East. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Germanus, opted to resign in 730 rather than submit to iconoclasm. And John of Damascus, who I mentioned in the last episode, and who is considered the last of the Church Fathers, also opposed Leo's policies. Let's talk about the different viewpoints here. On one hand, the iconoclasts saw this as idol worship. They appealed to the part in the Ten Commandments where God forbids his people to make graven images. The iconodulias pushed back and said, no, what's forbidden isn't making images. After all, God gives instructions to fashion a bronze serpent, or to put 2 cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, or to decorate the temple with all sorts of images. The command here is not to worship these graven images. Side note, if you want to hear how numbering the 10 Commandments influences our interpretation of the 10 Commandments, check out episode 126 called The 3 Different 10 Commandments. The iconoclasts pushed back and said, well, this sure looks like worship, and there grew to be a distinction between worship, the Latin word latria, and veneration, the Latin word dulia. The iconodulias said, we're not worshiping these images. Worship, or latria, belongs to God alone. And of course, these images are not God, but these images draw our attention to God and aid in that worship. Meanwhile, in the iconoclast camp, one might say, tomato, tomato. You call it veneration, but it sure looks like worship. In their mind, this was a distinction without a difference. And it's possible, too, that people went too far with the veneration. Maybe there were some poorly catechized Christians that didn't understand the distinction between latria and dulia. But the iconodulias insisted that the solution to a misguided practice wasn't to just get rid of icons carte blanche, because as they saw it, there was a sacramentality to these images, a connection between the physical and the spiritual world, so that when we venerated these images, we brought glory to God. When we venerate the cross, for example, we are bringing honor to Jesus. We're not worshiping the image, we're worshiping the prototype of which the image depicts. Leo III's successor, his son Constantine V, also opposed icons. He argued that God is not capable of being depicted or being circumscribed. Notice I said circumscribed, not circumcised. The iconodulias pushed back and said, yes, he can be circumscribed, and he has been. In Colossians 1:15, St. Paul says, quote, Jesus is the image, or in the Greek, icon of the invisible God, end quote. So therefore, if God has made himself visible in human form, we can depict him through paintings and statues and so forth, just like we do for other human beings. Well, Constantine V took this a step further. He decided to convene a council in 754 in the imperial palace called the Ieria, and this became known as the Council of Ieria. Constantine V only invited bishops that would support his position, so obviously the Pope was not included, and 338 bishops attended and ruled in favor of iconoclasm, the prohibition of icons. They reiterated that God himself cannot be depicted and that the only true image of Christ is the Eucharist. The iconodulias, including the Pope in Rome, considered this council to be fake, just like the robber council of Ephesus that we talked about in episode 152. Nevertheless, as councils go, they don't immediately settle the controversy. So, for example, Saint Stephen the Younger, also referred to as Saint Stephen the New, was a Byzantine monk who resisted iconoclasm and the Council of Nicaea. He was slandered with false stories of sexual impropriety, and when that didn't work, he was arrested and taken to trial. St. Stephen asked the judge, quote, "What would happen if you were to trample a coin with the emperor's image or icon on it?" End quote. The judge replied that the person would be put to death for dishonoring the image of the emperor, to which St. Stephen replied that far worse things would happen to those who defiled the images or icons of God. He then spit on the coin and trampled it. St. Stephen was thrown into prison, and for 11 months he essentially turned the prison into a monastery. When Constantine V heard about this, he had Stephen beaten to death. St. Stephen is the saint remembered for standing up for the veneration of icons. Let's fast forward to 780, when 9-year-old Constantine VI became the Byzantine emperor. His mother, Irene of Athens, exercised the regency for him. Tarasius became the patriarch of Constantinople, replacing the previous iconoclast patriarch. Together, Irene and Patriarch Tarasius worked with Pope Adrian I to restore icons in the church. This eventually resulted in the Second Council of Nicaea. About 350 bishops and delegates met together at the Hagia Sophia in Nicaea, not to be confused with the enormous Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and they met on September 24th, 787. Patriarch Tarasius had previously promised iconoclast bishops that they could retain their positions only if they gave up their iconoclast position and admitted to their error. So the stage was set to overturn the iconoclast imperial order, and that's exactly what happened. The council held 7 sessions over the course of about 3 weeks. Once again, a papal letter or encyclical was highly influential in determining the outcome of the council. This one was written by Pope Adrian I, who not only advocated his support for iconodulia, but repudiated the Byzantine Empire's efforts to gain authority over the church. After the letter was read, the bishops responded with, quote, "We follow, we receive, we admit," end quote. This council also revoked the legitimacy of the Council of Nicaea in 754. They affirmed the legitimacy and the authority of the previous 6 ecumenical councils, and at the last session they issued the following declaration of faith with respect to icons, quote, "As the sacred and life-giving cross is everywhere set up as a symbol, so also should the images of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, the holy angels, as well as those of the saints and other pious and holy men be embodied in the manufacture of sacred vessels, tapestries, vestments, etc., and exhibited on the walls of churches, in the homes, and in all conspicuous places, by the roadside and everywhere, to be revered by all who might see them. For the more they are contemplated, the more they move to fervent memory of their prototypes. Therefore, it is proper to accord to them a fervent and reverent veneration, not, however, the veritable adoration which, according to our faith, belongs to the divine being alone. For the honor accorded to the image passes over to its prototype, and whoever venerates the image venerated in the reality of what is there represented." End quote. Like we saw in the earlier councils, this council also issued 22 canons. These are really interesting canons, so let me briefly summarize them with a few comments, and as always, you can find the full text in the show notes. Canon 1 reaffirms the previous 6 ecumenical councils. The second canon requires that bishops know the Psalter, that is the 150 Psalms, by heart. Not just recite them, but really know them. Quite incredible that this was the second priority of this council with respect to the canons. Perhaps the sentiment was that these church problems could be better avoided if the leaders knew their scripture. The third canon declares null any bishop who is appointed by a secular ruler. So after decades of the Byzantine Empire trying to control the church, in this canon we are seeing the church take further steps towards the separation of church and state. Canon 4 prohibits bishops from accepting gifts, lest they become bribes, while Canon 5 prohibits simony, the buying and selling of church offices. The sixth canon reiterates a previous canon that requires bishops to hold local synods twice a year, but if they absolutely cannot, they must at least assemble once a year. Canon 7 states that all churches should have relics, and a bishop who consecrates a church without a relic shall be deposed. To this day, I believe pretty much every Catholic church has some sort of relic. Often relics are stored in the altar. Sometimes churches have a second or third degree relic. I've linked to an article in the show notes about relics. The eighth canon stipulates that only Jews who have had a sincere conversion should be received in the church. Canon 9 prohibits anyone owning a book or a document written by the iconoclasts. The 10th canon requires clergy to notify their bishop if they're going to leave their diocese. Canon 11 requires major episcopal palaces as well as monasteries to appoint an administrator. In fact, the 1983 Code of Canon Law has extended this to parishes. They are required to have administrators to ensure the proper functioning of the church. Canon 12 condemns bishops from selling off church-owned lands, and Canon 13 condemns using monasteries as public houses like hotels. The 14th canon prohibits lay people from reading from the ambo during Mass. The 15th canon prohibits priests from serving over 2 parishes, except in the more rural and less populated areas. Canon 16 punishes clergy for wearing ornate clothes and perfume. The 17th canon states that if you want to start to build a monastery, you have to have the means to finish it. The 18th canon forbids women living in bishops' houses or in monasteries. Canon 19 also prohibits simony, that people cannot pay to be ordained or to become monks or nuns. Canon 20 prohibits cohabitation of monks and nuns in monasteries. Men need to go live with the monks, women need to go live with the nuns. The 21st canon states that monks and nuns just can't translate from one monastery to another unless they go through a formal process whereby they are transferred. The last canon, Canon 22, states that lay women may eat with ordained men and monks, but it is inappropriate for a cleric or a monk to eat privately with a woman. Let's talk about the aftermath of this council. It took quite a while before this council was accepted as the Seventh Ecumenical Church Council. Part of the challenge centered around the political happenings in the West. Charlemagne was king of the Franks and Lombards and had seized control of Rome. The Pope, of course, was trying to be diplomatic, but at the same time, here comes this major decree stating that the Pope and the Byzantine Emperor had reached this unity regarding iconodulia. The Franks, in turn, were outraged that the Western Emperor Charlemagne was left out of the Second Council of Nicaea. So in 794, Charlemagne convened a local council in Frankfurt. A number of prominent bishops attended, though the Pope was not represented. They repudiated and invalidated the Second Council of Nicaea. However, ultimately, both the West and the East have since accepted the Second Council of Nicaea as an authoritative ecumenical council. But the political faction led by Charlemagne certainly caused a delay in the West. This wouldn't be the end of iconoclasm. During the Protestant Reformation, one of the major Protestant reformers, Huldrych Zwingli, led efforts in Switzerland to destroy icons. He and his followers went through churches, tearing down statues and destroying priceless sacred art. This strand of Protestantism became the origin of Anabaptists, which eventually became Amish and Mennonite. And if you're familiar with the Amish, you may know that they take iconoclasm to a whole level, refusing to even own pictures of loved ones lest they become idolatrous. We'll talk about this a little bit more in our next episode. There's another debate that has since developed from this council. Eastern Orthodox Christians sometimes accuse Catholics of idolatry because we tend to use statues while they tend to use icons. If you've ever been to an Eastern Orthodox church, you may have noticed that their churches are adorned with icons. While I'm less familiar with this argument, I've linked to a great video in the show notes of a Catholic priest refuting this argument based on this council. I'll end with this personal reflection. Researching this episode was extremely helpful for me. As someone who spent nearly 40 years as a Protestant, before this episode, I would still get a little uneasy about all the statues and icons and such. But in reading the Second Council of Nicaea's decisions, I understood better the purpose of religious art and the notion of venerating this art. Do people go too far with statues and icons? Sure, I think they do. I think there is a fine line between latria, worship, and dulia, veneration. But at the same time, since sacrifice is central to the Catholic and Orthodox understanding of worship, whereas Protestants define worship much differently since they have eliminated the sacrifice of the Mass, it's no wonder they confuse our dulia with their latria. To them, our dulia looks like their latria, and our latria looks completely foreign. One thing that stands out to me is that this council ruled not just that religious art like statues and icons are okay in churches. Not only is veneration of this religious art okay, but they said that churches and homes should have these images and that they should be venerated. Ultimately, this art is about drawing our attention to the prototype, to Christ our Lord, the kingdom of heaven, and the communion of saints. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.